Tonight, we examine a case that once commanded national attention and then passed into the ranks of England's unsolved railway murders. A single afternoon, a single compartment, a woman who never spoke of what was done to her, and a question that was never answered. The case of Florence Nightingale Shore begins in England in the winter of 1920, in the 2nd January, after the ending of the Great War. The country into which this case arrived was a country still occupied with the work of demobilisation, still counting its dead and receiving home the men and women who had served abroad. Florence Nightingale Shore was one of those returning servants of the war, a professional nurse lately released from years of duty in France, and it was on an ordinary journey to the Sussex coast that she was attacked and mortally injured in a railway carriage. She was 55 years of age. She had nursed soldiers through 4 years of war and had come home to peace. She did not survive the injuries she received on the afternoon of the 12th of January. To understand the setting of this case, it is necessary to describe the England of early 1920 and the particular world of the railways through which the case moved. The war had ended in November of 1918, and the 14 months that followed had been months of adjustment across the whole of the country. The armies were being reduced. The vast medical and nursing services that had grown to meet the demands of the war were being wound down, and the women who had staffed them, tens of thousands of them, were returning to civilian life. Many of these women had served far from home, in France, in the Mediterranean, in the hospitals of the coast and the casualty stations nearer the front. They came back to a country that was grateful and grieving in equal measure, and they came back for the most part quietly, resuming private lives that the war had interrupted. Florence Nightingale Shore was among them. The railway was the ordinary means by which such a journey was made. In the England of 1920, the railway was the artery of the nation, the way in which people of every class moved between the capital and the coast, between one town and the next, between work and rest. The lines running south from London to the Sussex coast carried a steady traffic of travellers to the seaside resorts of Bexhill, St Leonard's, on Sea, and Hastings, resorts that in the off-season of January stood quiet and grey under the winter light. The trains that served these lines were, in large part, of an older pattern. They were composed of separate compartments, each entered by its own door from the platform, with no corridor running the length of the carriage and no means of passing from one compartment to another once the train was in motion. A passenger who took a seat in such a compartment was, between one station and the next, entirely sealed off. There was no guard within reach, no communication with the rest of the train, no fellow passenger in an adjoining space who might see or hear what took place. This feature of the old non-corridor carriage was already, by 1920, understood to be a source of vulnerability for the traveller who journeyed alone, and it is a feature that lies at the very centre of this case. Into this setting Florence Nightingale Shore had returned in the closing weeks of 1919, a demobilised nurse, a woman of independent means, self-supporting and respected in her profession. She kept lodgings in London. She had friends on the Sussex coast whom she meant to visit. She was, by every account that survives, a capable and disciplined woman, settled in her circumstances and accustomed to travelling about the country as her work and her acquaintance required. It was such a visit, undertaken on an ordinary winter afternoon, that brought her to London Victoria on the 12th of January, and it was on the train she boarded there that the events of this case took place. Florence Nightingale Shore was born on the 9th of January 1865 into a distinguished English family connected by kinship to the Nightingales. It was through this connection that she received her name. Her family and the family of Florence Nightingale, the pioneer of modern nursing, were linked, and the great nurse stood as godmother to the child, who was accordingly named Florence Nightingale Shore in her honour. It is worth recording, for the sake of accuracy, that the surname Nightingale had itself come into that family through inheritance, the elder Florence Nightingale's own father having taken the name on succeeding to an estate. The two families were thus bound together, and the child born in 1865 carried the name of her celebrated kinswoman throughout her life. The elder Florence Nightingale had died in 1910, a decade before the events of this case, honoured across the world as the founder of professional nursing. It is one of the quiet particulars of the record that the woman who bore her name, and who followed her into the nursing profession, should herself become the subject of a criminal file. The family into which Florence Nightingale Shore was born was well connected and of independent means, established in the professional and landed class of Victorian England. She was raised in comfortable circumstances, in the manner of a family of that standing in the middle decades of the 19th century. The precise details of her parentage are not established beyond doubt in the accounts most readily available, and the fuller record of her early family belongs to the biographical study written of her in later years. What can be stated with confidence is that she came from a family of good standing, that she was not obliged by poverty to seek employment, and that her entry into professional nursing was undertaken as a vocation rather than as a necessity. She had at least one brother, a military man, and the connections of her family reached into the services and the professions in the ordinary way of such households. Nursing, in the years in which Florence Nightingale Shore came to it, was a profession in the course of transformation. The reforms associated with her kinswoman had, over the latter half of the 19th century, raised nursing from an occupation of low regard to a disciplined and respectable calling for educated women. Training schools had been established at the great hospitals, and the woman who trained at such a school emerged a professional, qualified and certificated, fit to take charge of a ward. Florence Nightingale Shore trained as a nurse in this new tradition, her training commonly associated with St Bartholomew's Hospital in London, one of the ancient hospitals of the capital, though the precise particulars of her training are held with something less than complete certainty in the general record. What is not in doubt is that she became a fully professional nurse, and that she gave her working life to the profession. Those who knew her, and those who recorded their impressions of her, described a woman of a consistent character. She was capable, she was disciplined, she was self-possessed and devoted to her duty. These are the qualities attributed to her across the accounts, and they are qualities consonant with the demands of the work she undertook, work that called for steadiness, for authority, and for the endurance of hardship. She did not marry. She remained single throughout her life, a circumstance not unusual among the professional nurses of her generation, for whom the calling was often understood to require a full and undivided commitment. She was, in the plainest terms the record allows, a respected professional nurse of independent means, a woman who had made her own way in a serious profession, and who had, by the time of the events of this case, given the greater part of her life to it. Her nursing career carried her into military service. She served with the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service and its reserve, the body responsible for the nursing of the British Army. And her service in military nursing reached back over a considerable span of years. Some accounts place her nursing service as early as the South African War at the turn of the century, though this earlier service is held with a lesser degree of certainty in the general record. What is beyond doubt is her service through the whole of the First World War. From 1914 to the war's end, she nursed the wounded of the British Army in France, across the entire course of the conflict, tending the men brought back from the fighting to the hospitals behind the lines. For this service, she was decorated. Among the honours she received was the Royal Red Cross, a genuine and documented decoration awarded for distinguished service in military nursing. She was, in the fullest sense the words carry, a decorated war nurse, and she had earned that description across 4 years of the hardest nursing the age could demand. What follows begins in London in 1920. By the second week of January in that year, Florence Nightingale Shore had returned from the war and taken up the settled routine of her civilian life. She was newly demobilised, a woman of independent means, self-supporting and at liberty to order her days as she chose. She had come through the war and come home, and the visit she planned for the afternoon of the 12th of January was of the most ordinary kind, a quiet journey to friends on the Sussex coast. It is the ordinariness of the occasion that the record insists upon. There was nothing in the arrangement of that afternoon to distinguish it from countless other journeys made by countless other travellers on the winter railways of England. On that afternoon, Florence Nightingale Shore came to London, Victoria, in the company of a close friend, Mabel Rogers. The two women were long acquainted, and Mabel Rogers had come to see her friend onto the train and away on her journey. This detail, small in itself, would prove to be of the first importance to everything that followed, for Mabel Rogers was the last person known to have spoken with Florence Nightingale Shore before she boarded, and it was Mabel Rogers who observed the circumstances of her departure. The train she was to take was the service departing Victoria in the afternoon and running south through Sussex toward Hastings and St Leonards-on-Sea, the ordinary coast service of that hour. Mabel Rogers saw her friend into a third-class compartment of the train. The two women had their parting on the platform, and Florence Nightingale Shore took her seat in the compartment as travellers did, settling herself for the journey down to the coast. The compartment was of the older, sealed pattern that has already been described, entered by its own door and cut off from the rest of the train once the journey began. As the moment of departure approached and the train stood ready to leave the platform, a man entered the same compartment in which Florence Nightingale Shore was seated. Mabel Rogers observed him. She described him afterwards as a man wearing a brown suit, and it is by this description that he's been known ever since. He entered the compartment as the train was about to depart, took his place within it, and was carried away with Florence Nightingale Shore as the train pulled out of Victoria and began its run to the south. That was the last that Mabel Rogers, or anyone who knew Florence Nightingale Shore, saw of her while she was yet well. The train drew out of the station and away towards Sussex, carrying in one of its sealed compartments a demobilised war nurse of 55 and a man in a brown suit whose identity was never established. From the moment the train left the platform, no witness could speak to what took place within that compartment. The account that follows is the account that the investigation was able to assemble afterwards, from the condition in which she was found, and from the movements of the train, and it is an account with a silence at its heart, for the one person who could have described what happened never recovered the power to do so. The train ran south out of London and into the winter countryside of Surrey and Sussex, following the line that carried the coast traffic down through the Weald toward the sea. The afternoon light of a January day is short, and by the time such a train was well upon its journey, the light over the downs would already have been failing, the fields and hedgerows greying toward dusk beyond the compartment windows. The train made its scheduled stops in the ordinary way, halting at the stations along the line, and at each halt the doors of the separate compartments were opened and shut by the passengers who came and went. Between those halts each compartment remained sealed and private, its occupants unseen by any other soul upon the train. Somewhere upon that run down through Sussex, in the interval between one station and the next, Florence Nightingale Shore was attacked. What took place within the compartment was never witnessed and never described by the one person who endured it. She was struck several heavy blows about the head. The blows were sufficient to render her unconscious and to inflict injuries that would prove mortal. She was left insensible, in her seat, gravely and, as it would emerge, fatally injured. The compartment being of the sealed pattern, no passenger in any adjoining space could have heard a cry or a struggle, and no guard could have reached her between the stations. Whoever had done this was carried on with her in the same sealed space, or else left the train at a station along the line. stepping down onto a platform in the ordinary way and passing from the record entirely. Her jewellery and some money were taken from her. The motive, so far as the rifled state of her effects could establish one, was robbery. The discovery came as the train approached Bexhill. 3 railwaymen, in the course of their duties, came to the compartment in which Florence Nightingale Shore was seated. They found her slumped in her seat, insensible, and bleeding from wounds about the head. She did not respond to them. She was alive, but she was gravely injured and beyond speech, unconscious in the corner of the compartment where she had been left. The railwaymen raised the alarm at once. What had appeared, until that moment, to be an ordinary compartment carrying an ordinary passenger down to the coast was found instead to contain a woman struck down and dying, and the machinery of response was set immediately in motion. Florence Nightingale Shore was removed from the train. She was taken from the compartment and conveyed to hospital, where she was received and where the attempt to preserve her life was undertaken by the medical men into whose care she passed. But the injuries she had received were of a kind from which recovery was not to be expected. She did not regain consciousness in any degree sufficient to speak of what had befallen her. She could not name her attacker. She could not describe him, nor say at what point upon the journey the attack had come, nor give any account whatever of what had been done to her in the sealed compartment of the afternoon train. She lay in the hospital for some days and, on the 16th of January 1920, 4 days after the attack, she died of her injuries. She was 55 years of age. From the moment she was struck to the moment of her death, she never recovered the power to describe the man who had done it. And this silence, absolute and permanent, is the central fact of the case. The gravity of what had occurred was recognised at once. The victim was a woman of standing, a decorated nurse of the war, the kinswoman and namesake of the most celebrated nurse in the history of the country, struck down upon an ordinary train in the course of an ordinary journey. The case was not one that could be left to the local force alone. Scotland Yard was brought in, and the investigation was formally opened under the direction of the Metropolitan Police, with the full seriousness that the standing of the victim and the nature of the crime demanded. Officers were assigned to the matter. The compartment was examined. The circumstances of the journey were reconstructed so far as they could be, and the inquiry fixed from the outset upon the one lead that the case afforded: the man in the brown suit whom Mabel Rogers had seen enter the compartment at Victoria. The account given by Mabel Rogers became the spine of the investigation. She had seen her friend onto the train. She had observed the man in the brown suit enter the same compartment as the train was about to depart. She was able to give such description of him as she had been able to observe in the moments upon the platform, and it was upon this description that the hopes of the inquiry principally rested. The investigation sought to establish who this man was, whether he had remained in the compartment during the journey, and at what station, if any, he had left the train. Appeals were made for witnesses. The stations along the line were canvassed. Railway staff and passengers who might have observed a man in a brown suit boarding or alighting at any point upon the route were sought out, in the hope that his movements might be traced from Victoria to whatever point he had quit the train. The difficulties confronting the investigation were considerable, and they arose in large part from the very nature of the railway on which the crime had been committed. The sealed compartment that had made the attack possible also made the gathering of evidence extraordinarily hard. There had been no witness within the compartment but the victim and her attacker. There had been no one in an adjoining space to hear or see. The passengers who had travelled on the same train had been distributed among its many separate compartments, each sealed from the others, and few, if any of them, could speak to anything beyond their own small portion of the journey. A man who entered a compartment at Victoria and left it at some station down the line would have been observed, at most, by whatever handful of persons happened to be upon the platform at the moment he stepped down, and in the failing light of a January afternoon, such observation was a slender thing on which to build a case. The physical evidence in the possession of the investigation was correspondingly thin. There was the compartment itself and the marks and traces it retained. There was the condition of the victim's effects, rifled of her jewellery and her money. There was the fact of the missing property, jewellery, and some sum of money taken from her in the course of the attack, but there was no weapon recovered at the scene that could be connected with certainty to the wounds, and there was no article of the stolen property recovered in any manner that pointed to a particular person. The investigators had a description of a man, an account of the theft, and the mute evidence of the compartment, and from these they were required to construct, if they could, the identity of a murderer who had vanished into the ordinary traffic of the railways. In the course of the inquiry, a suspect was arrested. He was a man who came under the attention of the investigation, and there were circumstances about him that appeared for a time to warrant the gravest suspicion. It was reported that the butt of a revolver in his possession bore traces of blood. It was further reported that a search of his lodgings had yielded a suit stained with blood. These were, on their face, circumstances of a most serious kind, and the investigation examined them with corresponding care. Yet the forensic science of 1920 was not equal to the demand that these circumstances placed upon it. The examination of blood was, in that period, a limited art. It was possible to establish that a stain was blood, and something of its character could be determined, but the means did not exist to demonstrate that a particular sample of blood had come from a particular person. The blood upon the revolver butt and the blood upon the suit could not be matched to Florence Nightingale Shore. There was no method by which the identity of the blood could be fixed to the victim, and in the absence of such a match, the circumstances, however suspicious, could not be made to bear the weight of a charge. The man who had been arrested was therefore released. Nothing could be proved against him. The blood could not be tied to the victim. No weapon could be conclusively connected to the wounds, and the stolen property was not traced to his possession in any manner that established his guilt. He was questioned and released, a man against whom suspicion had fallen and against whom nothing could be demonstrated to the standard that the law required. He was never charged. It must be stated plainly, and it must be held to throughout, that this man was never charged with the murder of Florence Nightingale Shore, that his guilt was never established, and that he stands in the record only as a man questioned and released, against whom nothing could be proved. The case did not close upon him. It did not close upon anyone. With the release of the arrested man, the investigation was left without a suspect against whom a case could be brought. The description of the man in the brown suit remained, but it could not be attached to any identified person. The trail, such as it had been, went cold. The appeals for witnesses did not produce the accounts that would have fixed the movements of the man who had shared the compartment. The physical evidence did not yield the identification that would have named him. The investigation continued for as long as there was anything to pursue, but the material out of which a prosecution might have been built was never assembled. The limits of the contemporary science, the sealed nature of the compartment, the failing winter light, and the ordinary anonymity of the railway had combined to shield the identity of whoever had struck Florence Nightingale Shore, and that identity was never recovered. The medical evidence in the case was placed in the hands of the foremost authority the country possessed. The examination of the medical evidence involved Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the Home Office pathologist who was, in the years around 1920, the preeminent figure in the forensic pathology of England, whose name was associated with the most serious criminal cases of the age. That the medical evidence should have been referred to Spilsbury is itself a measure of the seriousness with which the case was regarded, for his involvement was reserved for matters of the first importance. The cause of death was established as the head injuries sustained in the attack, blunt force injuries sufficient to render the victim unconscious and to prove fatal within a few days. She had never recovered consciousness in a degree that allowed her to speak. She had died on the 16th of January of the injuries received on the 12th. The medical facts of the matter were, in their essentials, settled. The injuries were severe, they were the cause of death, and their nature was consistent with the account of an attack delivered within the compartment. Yet even the involvement of so distinguished a pathologist could not supply what the case most needed, which was not a determination of how Florence Nightingale Shore had died, for that was plain enough, but a means of connecting the injuries to a particular hand. The medical evidence could establish the cause of death. It could not establish the identity of the person who had inflicted it. The principal evidential gap in the case lay precisely here, in the inability to connect any suspect or any weapon to the wounds that had killed her. The science of the day could describe the injury. It could not name the author of it. And so the medical evidence, thorough and authoritative as it was, joined the rest of the case as a body of established fact surrounding a central and permanent unknown. A coroner's inquest was convened to inquire into the death of Florence Nightingale Shore. The inquest is the proceeding by which, in English law, a sudden or violent death is formally examined, and in a case of this kind, its function was to establish who the deceased was, when and where, and by what means she had come to her death, and to return a verdict accordingly. The inquest was held before the coroner having jurisdiction, and it took evidence in the ordinary manner of such proceedings, hearing the witnesses whose testimony bore upon the death and receiving the medical findings that had been established. It was a proceeding conducted with the seriousness the case commanded, and its record forms one of the principal surviving accounts of the matter. Among the witnesses called before the coroner was Mabel Rogers. She gave her evidence of the last afternoon, of seeing her friend to the station, of the parting upon the platform, and of the man in the brown suit who had entered the compartment as the train was about to depart. Her testimony was the nearest the inquest could come to an account of the circumstances immediately before the attack, for she was the last person known to have seen Florence Nightingale Shore before the train drew out of Victoria. The railway men who had found the injured woman at Bexhill also gave their evidence, describing the state in which they had discovered her and the raising of the alarm. Through these witnesses, the inquest reconstructed, so far as the evidence permitted, the shape of the afternoon, the departure from Victoria, the entry of the man in brown, the sealed journey down through Sussex, and the discovery at Bexhill of a woman struck down and beyond speech. The medical evidence was placed before the inquest, the findings as to the cause of death, established through the examination in which Sir Bernard Spilsbury had taken part. The coroner and the jury were thus informed that the death had resulted from the injuries received in the attack, that those injuries had been severe and had proved fatal within a few days, and that the deceased had at no point recovered the power to describe what had been done to her or by whom. The inquest heard in sum that Florence Nightingale Shore had been robbed and fatally struck within a railway compartment, that she had died of her injuries, and that the person responsible had not been identified. Upon the evidence before it, the inquest returned its verdict. The verdict was one of willful murder against some person or persons unknown. This is the verdict returned by an English inquest when it is satisfied that a death was the result of deliberate and unlawful killing, but is unable to attach that killing to a named individual. It affirmed that Florence Nightingale Shore had been murdered. It affirmed that the murder was willful, a deliberate act and not a misadventure, and it recorded that the identity of the person who had committed it was unknown. No committal followed the inquest, for no individual had been charged, and there was accordingly no person to be sent forward for trial. It followed from the state of the evidence that there was no trial. No person was ever tried for the murder of Florence Nightingale Shore. The man who had been arrested had been released without charge, and no other suspect was ever brought to the point of prosecution. There was no defendant, no arraignment, no jury empaneled to try the question of guilt, and no verdict of a court upon any individual. The case never reached the assizes, for it never produced the accused person whom the assizes would have tried. In this respect, the record of Florence Nightingale Shore's death is a record of a proceeding arrested at the threshold. An investigation opened, a suspect examined and released, an inquest held, and a verdict of murder by a person unknown returned. And there the legal process halted, having no one against whom it might proceed further. There was, in consequence, no sentence, for there was no conviction. No one was punished for the killing of Florence Nightingale Shore, because no one was ever found guilty of it, and no one was ever found guilty of it because no one was ever charged. The ordinary sequence of the criminal law: arrest, charge, committal, trial, verdict, and sentence was broken at its second stage and never resumed. What remained, when the investigation had exhausted its leads and the inquest had returned its verdict, was a body of established facts surrounding a permanent absence: the fact of the murder, the fact of the robbery, the fact of the medical findings, the fact of the man in the brown suit, and the unfilled space where the identity of the murderer should have stood. The immediate aftermath of the case was marked by intense attention in the national press. The killing of a decorated war nurse upon an ordinary train in the first weeks of the new year and the second year of the peace was a matter of wide public concern. The victim's connection to Florence Nightingale, whose name she bore and whose profession she had followed, gave the case a resonance beyond the particulars of the crime itself. Here was a woman who had nursed the wounded of the war through 4 years in France, decorated for that service, kin and namesake to the founder of modern nursing, struck down not in the war, but in the peace, not abroad but at home, upon a train running down to the Sussex coast. The public dismay at such a killing was considerable, and the newspapers of January and the following weeks gave the matter the prominence it commanded. The distress the case occasioned was sharpened by the very ordinariness of the circumstances in which the crime had occurred. Florence Nightingale Shore had done nothing that any traveller did not do. She had boarded a scheduled train at a great London terminus in the afternoon, taken a seat in a third-class compartment, and set out upon a short journey to visit friends. That such a journey should end in murder struck at a sense of ordinary security, for the railway was the common means of travel for people of every station, and the sealed compartment in which she had died was a feature of the trains that carried the whole nation about its business. The case gave a particular and troubling shape to a vulnerability that had been latent in the design of the railways for decades. The vulnerability of the lone passenger sealed between stations beyond sight or hearing of any help. As the weeks and months passed and no arrest was made, the case took its place among the celebrated unsolved murders of England. It did not fade entirely from memory, as many crimes of the period did, and the reasons for its persistence were bound up with the identity of the victim. A crime that might, committed against an unknown traveller, have slipped quietly from public notice was held in memory by the standing and the name of the woman against whom it had been committed. The murder of Florence Nightingale Shore became and has remained one of the classic unsolved railway murders of the country, cited among those cases in which the machinery of investigation brought to bear with full seriousness upon a crime of the gravest kind was nonetheless unable to name the person responsible. The case has persisted too, through its passage into print and into fiction in the years that followed. A full-length modern study of the matter was written under the title The Nightingale Shore Murder, a work that assembled the biography of the victim and the narrative of the case in detail, and that stands as the definitive modern account of her life and death. Through such a study, the particulars of the case, the family and the upbringing, the The nursing career and the war service, the last afternoon, and the failed investigation were preserved and set out at length for a later readership. The existence of so thorough a treatment is itself a mark of the hold the case has kept upon those who study the unsolved crimes of the period. The case has been recognised, further, as the inspiration behind a work of modern fiction, a series of novels that opens with a murder upon a train, modelled upon the killing of Florence Nightingale Shore. The fictional victim who is struck down in the opening of that series was drawn from the real woman and the real crime, and through this literary afterlife, the case has reached readers who might never otherwise have encountered it. The persistence of the case in this form belongs to the ordinary manner in which certain crimes, unresolved in fact, pass into story, furnishing the material out of which later imaginations construct their fictions. The record of the real case remained where it had always been, in the files of the investigation and the account of the inquest, while the fictional version carried the shape of the crime to a wider audience. Beyond these principal works, the case has continued to be recounted in the general literature of English true crime, in histories of unsolved murders, and in accounts of the crimes of the early 20th century, where it takes its place among the railway mysteries of the age. It is remembered in these accounts as a case that gathered the full resources of the period, the direction of Scotland Yard, the involvement of the foremost pathologist in the country, the attention of the national press, and yet ended without an answer. The persistence of the case in public memory has rested less upon any dramatic feature of the crime itself, which was in its essentials a robbery ending in a fatal assault, than upon the identity of the victim and the completeness of the failure to solve it. The historical significance of the case lies partly in what it reveals of the state of criminal investigation in England in 1920. The involvement of Scotland Yard and of Sir Bernard Spilsbury marks it as a high-profile inquiry of the early post-war years, conducted with the best means the period afforded, and yet those means proved insufficient. The examination of blood could establish that a stain was blood, but could not tie it to a particular person. The compartment could be searched, but it yielded no article that named the killer. The description of a man could be circulated, but it could not be attached to an identified individual amid the anonymous traffic of the railways. The case illustrates with a certain clarity the limits of contemporary forensic science, the point at which the methods of 1920 reached the boundary of what they could establish and could go no further. The social setting in which the case unfolded was that of England in the immediate aftermath of the Great War, a country in the midst of demobilisation and adjustment. The vast services raised for the war, the armies and the medical and nursing establishments that had supported them were being reduced, and the men and women who had staffed them were returning to civilian life in their hundreds of thousands. Florence Nightingale Shore was one of these returning servants of the war, a nurse lately released from years of duty in France, resuming the private life that the war had suspended. The grief and dislocation of the period lay over the whole country, which was still absorbing its losses and receiving home its survivors. That a woman who had come through such service should be killed in the peace, upon an ordinary train, gave the case its particular resonance in the England of 1920, and it is against this setting of a nation newly at peace and still counting its cost that the case must be understood. The theories advanced to explain the killing of Florence Nightingale Shore have remained from the first matters of conjecture rather than of proof, and they must be set out as such. The most straightforward explanation, and the one most consonant with the evidence of the rifled effects, is that of an opportunistic robbery committed by a fellow passenger. On this account, the man who entered the compartment did so with no prior knowledge of the woman already seated there, saw in her a traveller alone in a sealed compartment, carrying jewellery and money, and attacked her for the sake of what she carried, leaving the train at a station down the line with her property upon him. This explanation requires no special design, no acquaintance between the parties, and no motive beyond the theft that the state of her effects established. It rests, however, upon inference rather than upon any proof, for the man who entered the compartment was never identified, and whether the man in the brown suit was the assailant was never established. A second strand of conjecture fixed upon the man in the brown suit himself as the assailant, on the ground that he was the last person believed to have shared the compartment, and the only person, beyond the victim, whose presence within it was attested. Yet the attestation of his presence came from the platform at Victoria, from the observation of Mabel Rogers as the train was about to depart, and it could not follow him through the sealed journey down through Sussex. Whether he remained in the compartment throughout, whether he left it at an early station and gave place to another, whether some further passenger entered at a stop along the line, the evidence could not say. The man in the brown suit was a description without a name, a figure fixed at the moment of departure and lost thereafter, and the theory that made him the killer could be neither established nor dismissed. All such theories remained unproven, and they remain unproven still. The record affords the facts of the robbery and the assault, and withholds the identity of the hand that committed them. The vulnerability that the case exposed was a vulnerability inherent in the construction of the railways of the day, and it was one that had been recognised before the killing of Florence Nightingale Shore, and was recognised more sharply after it. The non-corridor carriage, composed of separate compartments, each sealed between stations, had been the ordinary rolling stock of the British railways for the greater part of their history. It was efficient in its use of space, and convenient in the loading and unloading of passengers at busy platforms, and for the great majority of journeys it presented no difficulty whatever. But it carried within its design a hazard for the lone traveller, and above all for the woman travelling alone, who upon taking her seat in such a compartment was cut off, for the duration of each stage of the journey, from every other soul upon the train. There was no corridor along which a guard might pass. There was no communication with the adjoining compartments. There was, in the older stock, no means by which a passenger in distress might summon help between one station and the next. This hazard had produced, over the decades before 1920, a small number of notable crimes committed upon the railways, crimes whose rarity was matched by the disquiet they occasioned, precisely because they struck at the ordinary security of a means of travel used by the whole of the population. A murder committed in the sealed privacy of a railway compartment was a crime of a particular character, difficult to witness, difficult to interrupt, and difficult afterwards to investigate, for the very features that made it possible also frustrated the gathering of evidence. The case of Florence Nightingale Shore belonged to this small and troubling class, and it gave the class a fresh and prominent instance in the early years of the peace. The general recognition that the sealed compartment was a place of danger for the solitary passenger was, in the years that followed, a matter of continuing concern to the railway companies and to the travelling public, and the design of carriages and the provision of means of communication upon trains were subjects to which that concern was directed. The world into which Florence Nightingale Shore had returned, and to which she belonged in her last months, was the world of the demobilised professional woman of the war generation. She was one of a great number of women whose lives the war had drawn into service, and whose lives the peace was now returning to their own ordering. The nursing services in particular had expanded enormously to meet the demands of 4 years of war, and the women who had staffed them, trained professionals and wartime volunteers alike, were by 1919 and 1920 taking up again the threads of civilian existence. For many this was a return to homes and families. For a woman such as Florence Nightingale Shore, single, of independent means, and settled in her profession, it was a return to a self-directed life in lodgings of her own, with her own acquaintance and her own arrangements, at liberty to visit friends upon the coast as the fancy took her on a winter afternoon. She belonged to that generation of professional women who had made their own way, who supported themselves, and who ordered their own days without reference to husband or household, and the ordinariness of her last journey was the ordinariness of such a life. The Sussex coast to which she was travelling was, in that January, a coast in its winter quiet. The resorts strung along that stretch of the shore, Bexhill and St Leonards-on-Sea and Hastings, were places whose season was the summer, when the visitors came down from London and the inland towns to take the sea air and fill the lodging houses and the promenades. In January, those same places stood grey and largely empty under the short days and the winter light, the sea heavy along the shingle, the front deserted, the boarding houses closed or nearly so, the residents keeping to themselves against the cold. It was to friends in such a coast that Florence Nightingale Shore was bound, a quiet visit in the dead of the season, the kind of small private errand that fills the winter of a settled life. The train that carried her ran down through the Weald and across the low country toward this off-season shore, and it was upon that run, with the winter light failing over the downs, that her journey was broken. The name she carried lent the case a particular poignancy in the public mind, and it is a name that requires a moment's care in the telling, for it bound her to the most honoured figure in the history of her profession. Florence Nightingale, the pioneer of modern nursing, had died in 1910, 10 years before the killing, full of years and honour, having transformed nursing from a disregarded occupation into a disciplined and respected calling. The woman who bore her name and stood as her goddaughter had followed her into that calling and had given it the same lifelong service, through the ordinary wards and through the military hospitals of a great war. That the goddaughter and namesake of Florence Nightingale should herself be murdered upon a train, and that her murder should go unsolved, was a circumstance that fixed the case in memory, as few unsolved crimes of the period were fixed. The name was a thread that ran from the founder of modern nursing to a sealed compartment on the Sussex line, and it was in part by that thread that the case was held. What the record finally establishes is a narrow and certain set of facts surrounded by a wide uncertainty. It is established that Florence Nightingale Shore was a decorated nurse of the war, the goddaughter and namesake of the founder of modern nursing, a woman of independent means and settled profession. It is established that on the afternoon of the 12th of January, 1920, she was seen onto a train at London Victoria by her friend Mabel Rogers, that a man in a brown suit entered her compartment as the train departed, and that she was found at Bexhill struck down and beyond speech. It is established that she was robbed of her jewellery and some money, that she died of her injuries on the 16th of January, that the medical evidence involved Sir Bernard Spilsbury, that a suspect was arrested and released without charge, and that an inquest returned a verdict of wilful murder against a person or persons unknown. Around these established facts lies everything the record could not supply: the identity of the man who entered the compartment, the point upon the line at which the attack was made, and the name of the person who struck her. No arrest was ever made. The investigation was formally closed. The case remains open. The record remains incomplete. That is where the record of the first case ends. We turn now to a second story, quieter in its beginnings than the first and set some years earlier, in a corner of the country far from the railway lines and the capital, among market villages where everyone was known to everyone, and yet it turned upon the same question that no inquest and no trial could finally answer. The case of Annie Bella Wright begins in the villages of Leicestershire in the summer of 1919. It was a landscape of small settlements and old lanes, of farmland and hedgerow, lying a few miles to the south and east of the town of Leicester, and it hadn't greatly changed in its outward appearance for a generation. The Great War had ended some 8 months before, and the men who had gone from these villages to the fighting were returning, or had returned, to civilian lives that did not always fit them as they had left them. Leicester itself was a manufacturing town of some size, given over in large part to the making of hosiery, of boots and shoes, and of rubber goods, and the mills and works of the town, drew their labour from the surrounding country as much as from the streets nearby. The villages that ringed the town, places such as Stoughton, Galby, Little Stretton and Houghton on the hill, were small and agricultural, joined to one another and to the town by a network of quiet roads and older tracks, some of them Roman in origin. One such track ran across the high ground to the east of the town. It was known in the district as an old road, a lonely way that carried little traffic, and it passed through open country between the scattered villages. In the summer of 1919, the ordinary means of moving along these roads for a working man or a working woman who did not keep a horse was the bicycle. The bicycle had become, in those years, the common vehicle of country people, the means by which a young woman might travel to her work, visit her relations, or ride out on a fine evening, and it carried with it a measure of independence that had not been available to her mother's generation. It is against this ordinary background of village and lane and bicycle, of a country settling uneasily back into peace, that the events of the 5th of July must be set. The evenings of that early July were long and warm. In that latitude, in high summer, the light held late into the evening, and it was possible to ride the country roads in daylight until well past 8 o'clock and beyond. The harvest was not yet in. The lanes lay quiet in the long light, bordered by hedges and open fields, and a person moving along them might go some distance and meet no one at all. This is the setting in which Annie Bella Wright lived and worked, and in which she died. Annie Bella Wright, known to her family and to all who knew her as Bella Wright, was 21 years of age in the summer of 1919. Her home was at Stoughton, one of the small villages lying to the southeast of Leicester, and she was one of a large family. The precise number of her brothers and sisters is not established with certainty in the surviving record, and it is enough to say that she was a daughter of a numerous village household of the labouring and working sort, of the kind that was common in the Leicestershire countryside of the period. She had grown up among these lanes and knew them well, and the distances between the villages, which might seem considerable to a stranger, were to her the familiar geography of home. Her employment was in the town. Bella Wright worked as a hand in a rubber mill in Leicester, one of the works that made the tyres and rubber goods for which the town was in part known. The exact establishment is given differently in different accounts, and the surviving record does not fix it beyond dispute, but that her labour was factory labour in the rubber trade is well supported. She worked at the time of her death on the night shift, which meant that her hours ran through the darkness and that her travelling to and from the works was done at the edges of the day. To reach her work from the village and to return, she rode a bicycle along the country roads, a journey of some miles that she made as a matter of routine. The bicycle was therefore not, in her case, a thing of leisure only, but the practical means by which a young countrywoman held down employment in the town while continuing to live among her own people in the village. By every account that survives, Bella Wright was a young woman of good character and steady habits, well thought of by those who knew her, capable in her work and respectable in her conduct. Nothing in her circumstances or in her manner of living suggested trouble of any kind, and there was nothing in her situation that would later furnish an explanation for what befell her. She was, so far as the record shows, an ordinary young woman of the district, known and liked, going about an ordinary life of work and family. There is mention, in some accounts, of an attachment, a young man said to have been serving in the Navy, but the record does not establish this with certainty, and nothing in the case turned upon it. It is enough to say that she was single, that she was 21, and that she was a person of unremarkable and settled life until the evening of the 5th of July. What follows begins in the Leicestershire villages in the summer of 1919. On the evening of Saturday, the 5th of July, 1919, Bella Wright set out from her home to visit relations in the neighbouring village of Galby. Her uncle, a man named George Measures, lived at Galby in a cottage, and it was to him and to the household there that she rode out that evening. She travelled, as was her custom, by bicycle along the quiet roads that join the villages of the district in the long light of the summer evening. The distance was not great, a matter of a few miles across the country, and it was a journey she was well able to make and had doubtless made before. She did not, however, arrive at Goulby alone. When she reached her uncle's cottage that evening, she was in the company of a man, a stranger to the household, who rode with her upon a bicycle of his own. The bicycle upon which this man rode was of a distinctive colour. It was green, an unusual shade for a machine of that kind, and it was this green bicycle that would give the case the name by which it has been known ever since. The man appeared to have fallen in with Bella Wright somewhere upon the road, in the ordinary way that two cyclists travelling the same lanes might come together, and he had ridden with her as far as Goulby. The relations at Goulby took notice of him. While Bella Wright went into the cottage to visit, the man remained outside, waiting about in the road with his green machine, and the members of the household saw him there, and afterwards were able to describe both the man and his bicycle. He did not come in, and he was not known to any of them, but he made no attempt to conceal himself, and he waited in the open for Bella Wright to conclude her visit. The green bicycle, being an object of some singularity, fixed itself in the memory of those who saw it, and the description of the machine and of the man who rode it would in time become the whole focus of the inquiry that followed. Bella Wright remained at her uncle's cottage for something over an hour. When she left at about 8:45 in the evening, with the summer light still holding, the man on the green bicycle left with her. The two of them rode away together from Goulby, turning toward the roads that led back in the direction of her home at Stoughton, by way of the lonely lanes that crossed the high ground near Little Stretton. This was the last that any member of her family saw of Bella Wright alive. What passed upon the road, after she and her companion rode out of sight of the cottage at Goulby, is not established by any witness, and it is upon that unwitnessed stretch of road, in the last of the daylight, that the case turns. The record establishes the following with certainty. Bella Wright left her uncle's house at Goulby at about 8:45 on the evening of the 5th of July, in the company of a stranger upon a green bicycle. Her intended route lay homeward, across the quiet country towards Stoughton. She did not reach her home within an hour of her leaving Goulby, and while the light of the long evening still lay upon the fields, she was found lying in the road, some distance from the village. What had happened in the interval was not seen by any person who afterward came forward, and it is the central and unanswered fact of the case that no witness observed the death of Bella Wright. The place at which she was found was a lonely stretch of the old road near Little Stretton, a way that carried little traffic and passed through open country between the villages. It was here, upon the road, that a local farmer came upon her as the evening drew on. The farmer, whose name was Joseph Cowell, was passing along the road when he saw her lying in it, and beside her lay her bicycle. His first impression, and it was a natural one, was that there had been an accident of the ordinary kind, that the young woman had fallen from her machine, or had been taken faint, and lay in the road for one of the common reasons that a cyclist might come to grief upon a country lane. There was, upon a first view, nothing to indicate that a crime had been committed. It was only upon closer examination that the true nature of the matter appeared. When Bella Wright was looked at more nearly, it was found that she was dead, and that her death was not the result of any fall or faintness. She had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. The discovery of the wound transformed the matter at once from an accident upon the road into a case of violent death, and it was this that set in motion the inquiry that would occupy the county, and in time the country, for the better part of a year. She was dead when she was found, and she had died, as the evidence would establish, within a short time of leaving Goulby. There was, near the place where she lay, a further detail that would fasten itself upon the case and would not afterward be shaken from it. In a gateway close by, in the field beside the road, there lay the body of a dead carrion crow. The bird was gorged and bloodied, and its presence at that spot, so near to where the young woman had fallen, struck those who saw it as a strange thing, and it has been remarked upon in every account of the case from that day to this. What connection, if any, the dead crow bore to the death of Bella Wright has never been established, and it is reported here, as it has always been reported, as a curious circumstance of the scene, and nothing more. A spent bullet of the kind fired from a service revolver was afterward found in the road in the vicinity of the place where she had lain. The discovery of Bella Wright's body upon the road near Little Stretton in the evening of the 5th of July was thus at first mistaken for an accident, and only afterward understood to be a case of violent death. A local farmer had found her lying beside her bicycle. A single gunshot wound to the head had ended her life within an hour of her leaving her uncle's cottage. Beside the scene lay a dead crow, and in the road nearby a spent bullet was recovered. These were the facts as they stood upon the first evening, and from them the inquiry proceeded. The death having been established as a violent one, the matter passed at once into the hands of the county constabulary, and the investigation was formally opened. Officers were dispatched to the scene, and the ground upon which the young woman had been found was examined. The body was removed, and arrangements were made for a medical examination. From the outset, the direction of the inquiry was governed by a single circumstance above all others, which was that Bella Wright had last been seen alive in the company of an identifiable stranger, a man upon a green bicycle, who had ridden away with her from Goulby toward the very road on which she was afterward found. The whole weight of the investigation therefore came to rest upon the finding of that man and that machine. The relations at Goulby who had seen the man were questioned, and their descriptions were taken down. Her uncle, George Measures, and the others of the household, who had observed the stranger waiting in the road, gave accounts of his appearance, of his manner, and of the green bicycle he rode. The bicycle, being of an uncommon colour, was the most distinctive particular that the witnesses could furnish, and it was upon the green machine that the officers of the constabulary fixed their attention. A man might alter his appearance or remove himself from the district, but a bicycle of that singular colour was a thing that could be traced if only it could be found, and the search for it became the labour of the months that followed. Inquiries were made throughout the district and beyond it. The description of the man and of the green bicycle was circulated, and the case, by reason of its strange particulars and the youth and respectability of the victim, drew the notice of the newspapers and passed rapidly from a local matter into one that was followed across the country. The public was asked to assist in the finding of the green bicycle and of the man who had ridden it. Reports and suggestions came in, as they do in a case that has seized the public attention, and each was examined, but the man was not identified and the machine was not found. Weeks passed and then months, and the green bicycle remained the one solid object at the centre of the case, plainly described by credible witnesses, and yet entirely beyond the reach of the officers who sought it. The difficulty was a real one, and it is worth setting out plainly. There was no want of a description. Several persons had seen the man at close quarters and in good light, and their accounts of the green bicycle agreed. But a description, however good, could not of itself produce the man, and there was nothing else to work upon. No name was attached to the stranger. No one in the district knew him. He had appeared upon the road, ridden with the young woman to Goulby and away from it again, and then vanished into the summer country as completely as if he had never been. The bullet found in the road established the manner of death and indicated that the weapon had been a revolver of a service pattern, of the kind that had passed in great numbers into private hands during and after the war. But a spent bullet, without the weapon that had fired it, could not be traced to any owner. For the better part of half a year, therefore, the investigation was at a standstill. held up for want of the one object that might carry it forward. The medical examination of Bella Wright was conducted in the days following her death, and its findings were given afterward in evidence. A post-mortem examination was carried out by the examining physician, and the cause of death was formally established. The injury was a gunshot wound to the head, and it had been rapidly fatal. The medical evidence determined that death had followed swiftly upon the infliction of the wound, and that Bella Wright had died where she was found, or very near to it, within a short time of the shot being fired. The examining doctors gave their evidence at the inquest and afterward at the trial, and their conclusions as to the cause and manner of death were not in dispute. There was, however, one aspect of the medical and ballistic evidence that would become a matter of contention, and it must be noted here, for it lay at the heart of the case that came afterward to be argued in court. The question concerned the bullet, and whether the round that had caused the fatal wound could be shown, with certainty, to correspond to the ammunition that would in time be connected with the man the police sought. The forensic science of the year 1919 was not what it would later become, and the examination of a spent bullet and the drawing of firm conclusions as to the weapon that had fired it and the cartridges from which it had come was a matter attended by considerable uncertainty. This uncertainty, established at the medical stage of the inquiry, would be the ground on which the whole legal contest was afterward fought. An inquest into the death of Bella Wright was opened before the coroner in July of 1919 in the ordinary course, the law requiring that a violent or unexplained death be inquired into by a coroner sitting with a jury. The proceedings gathered the witnesses to the last hours of the young woman's life and to the finding of her body. Her uncle and the relations at Goulby gave evidence of her visit and of the man on the green bicycle who had accompanied her and waited outside and ridden away with her. Their descriptions of the stranger and of his machine were placed formally upon the record of the inquest, and it is from this stage of the proceedings, as much as from any other, that the case took its enduring shape. The farmer, Joseph Cowell, who had found the body in the road, gave his account of the discovery, of the first impression of an accident, and of the finding of the wound. The medical witnesses gave evidence of the cause of death and of the gunshot wound to the head. The coroner and the jury heard, in their proper order, the circumstances of Bella Wright's last evening, from her leaving home to visit her uncle, to her being found dead upon the lonely road near Little Stretton within the hour. The spent bullet recovered from the road was spoken to, and the strange detail of the dead crow in the gateway was among the matters that came before the inquest, as it came before the public. At the time the inquest sat, the man on the green bicycle had not been identified, and no person stood accused of the death. The coroner's jury was therefore in the position of inquiring into a killing whose perpetrator was unknown. Upon the evidence before it, the jury returned a verdict of wilful murder against a person or persons unknown. The verdict fixed in law what the circumstances had already made plain, that Bella Wright had not died by accident or by her own hand, but had been unlawfully killed, and that the person who had killed her had not been found. The inquest closed with the case in that condition, the description of the green bicycle and its rider standing upon the record as the sole thread by which the unknown assailant might yet be reached. For the remainder of the year 1919, the case rested there, unsolved and much discussed, and it might have remained so indefinitely had it not been for the recovery of the green bicycle. The breakthrough, when it came in the manner that so much of the case had turned upon, through the machine itself. In February of 1920, some 7 months after the death, a green bicycle frame was brought up out of a canal near Leicester. The circumstances of its recovery were ordinary enough. The frame was raised from the water in the course of the working of the canal, snagged and drawn up, and it might easily have passed unremarked but for the singular colour that had by then become notorious throughout the district. When the recovered frame was examined, it was found to bear the marks of a deliberate attempt to prevent its identification. The serial numbers by which a bicycle might be traced to its maker, and through the maker's records to its purchaser, had been filed away. Someone had taken the trouble to remove the identifying numbers from the machine before consigning it to the canal, plainly in the hope that, if it were ever found, it could not be connected to any person. This filing of the numbers, so far from ending the inquiry, gave it new life, for it showed that the bicycle was a thing someone had wished to be rid of and to render nameless, and that was itself a matter of the gravest significance in a case that had turned from the beginning upon a green bicycle and the man who rode it. The work of tracing the machine, despite the removal of its numbers, was undertaken with great care. Although the principal serial numbers had been filed away, the makers of bicycles were in the habit of stamping identifying marks in more than one place, and a number survived upon a concealed part of the frame that the person who had defaced the machine had overlooked. By means of this surviving mark, the frame was traced to its maker, and through the maker's records the bicycle was followed from its manufacture through the hands of those who had owned it until it came at last to a particular man. The green bicycle, which for half a year had been the object of a fruitless search, now, once recovered and painstakingly traced, delivered up the name that the whole inquiry had wanted. Further recoveries were made from the canal in the same connection. A revolver holster and a quantity of cartridges were brought up from the water, articles of the same military pattern as the weapon that the evidence indicated had fired the fatal shot, and their presence in the canal, together with the defaced bicycle, formed part of the case that would afterward be laid before the court. The man to whom the bicycle was traced was a former officer of the army who had served in the late war and who followed the profession of a schoolmaster. His name was Ronald Vivian Light. He was at this time about 33 years of age. Upon the tracing of the bicycle and the recovery of the articles from the canal, Ronald Light was identified, questioned, and in due course arrested and charged with the willful murder of Bella Wright. When Ronald Light was first approached and questioned, his initial position was one of denial. He denied that he was the man who had ridden the green bicycle in the company of Bella Wright, and he denied any knowledge of the events of the 5th of July. This position could not be maintained. The tracing of the bicycle to him, despite the filing of its numbers, and the recovery of the holster and cartridges from the canal, together with the accounts of the witnesses who had seen the man at Goulby, placed him at the centre of the case, and his denial gave way. He was arrested and charged with the willful murder of Bella Wright, and the matter proceeded toward trial. The account that he would in time give, and which formed the substance of his defence, was that he had indeed been the man upon the green bicycle, that he had ridden with the young woman, but that he had not killed her. The investigation had thus, after long delay, brought a man before the court, and the case that had begun upon a lonely road in July of 1919 was now to be tried at the assizes. The tracing of a defaced serial number upon a machine drawn from a canal had furnished the connection that half a year of searching had failed to supply. The officers of the constabulary had followed the one solid object in the case, the green bicycle, from the road at Goulby to the bed of the canal, and thence through the surviving mark to a name and a man. Whether that man was the man who had fired the fatal shot was the question that no part of the investigation had answered, and it was the question that would now be placed before a jury. The trial of Ronald Vivian Light for the willful murder of Bella Wright was held at the Leicester Assizes at Leicester Castle in June of 1920. It occupied 3 days. In the course of the second week of that month, the presiding judge conducted the proceedings in the ordinary manner of a trial for murder at the assizes, and the case drew the close attention of the public and the press, as it had done from the first. The prosecution was conducted on behalf of the Crown by senior counsel, and the defence of the accused was undertaken by Sir Edward Marshall Hall, a King's Counsel of the greatest celebrity, whose reputation as an advocate in cases of this kind stood at that time as high as any at the English bar. The charge laid against the prisoner was the willful murder of Bella Wright, and to that charge Ronald Light pleaded not guilty. The trial therefore proceeded upon the issue of whether the Crown could establish, to the satisfaction of the jury, and beyond reasonable doubt, that the man who had admittedly ridden with the young woman on the evening of her death had also fired the shot that killed her. The prosecution and the defence were agreed upon a great deal. It was not in dispute that Bella Wright had been shot dead upon the road near Little Stretton on the evening of the 5th of July, nor that a man upon a green bicycle had been in her company shortly before. The contest was upon the narrow and decisive point of whether that man had done the killing. The case for the Crown was built upon the sequence of circumstances that the investigation had assembled. It was urged that Ronald Light was the last person seen in the company of Bella Wright before her death, that he was the man upon the green bicycle described by the relations at Galby, and that he had ridden away with her toward the road on which she was shortly afterward found dead. It was urged further that his conduct after the death was the conduct of a man with something to conceal. He had not come forward when the country was ringing with appeals for the man on the green bicycle to make himself known. He had, on the contrary, taken his machine and disposed of it in the canal, having first filed away the numbers by which it might be traced, and he had thrown into the same water a revolver holster and cartridges of a military pattern. It was urged that a bullet found near the body was of a type consistent with service ammunition, to which, as a former officer, he had access. To this the defence, in the hands of Marshal Hall, made an answer that conceded much and contested the vital point. It was admitted on behalf of the prisoner that Ronald Light had been the man upon the green bicycle, that he had ridden with Bella Wright, that he had afterwards said nothing, hidden the machine, defaced it, and cast it and the holster and cartridges into the canal. But it was contended that these were the actions of a frightened man and not the actions of a murderer. The defence presented Ronald Light as a former officer of good position, lately returned from the war, who, on discovering that the police were seeking the man on the green bicycle in connection with a murder, had been seized by fear of the suspicion that would fall upon him and by dread of the scandal, and had concealed his connection with the machine out of that fear and not out of guilt of the killing. The heart of the defence, however, lay in its attack upon the evidence connecting the fatal shot to the prisoner. Marshal Hall directed his effort against the ballistic and medical evidence, contending that the bullet which had caused the death could not be shown, with the certainty that a capital charge demanded to correspond to the ammunition attributed to Ronald Light. The state of forensic knowledge at that date did not permit the firm identification of a bullet with a particular weapon or a particular cartridge in the manner that later years would make familiar, and the defence pressed this uncertainty to the full. It was argued that there was no proof that the prisoner had fired the shot, and it was suggested that the death might have come about in some other way, that a stray shot fired at a distance and not aimed at the young woman at all could not be excluded upon the evidence. The prisoner himself gave evidence in his own defence. He entered the witness box and was examined and cross-examined, and by the accounts of those present, he bore himself throughout with composure. He gave his account of having met the young woman upon the road, of having ridden with her, of having parted from her, and of his subsequent fear and concealment, and he maintained under questioning that he had not harmed her. His calm bearing in the witness box was remarked upon at the time, and has been remarked upon since, and it is traditionally reckoned, together with the handling of the ballistic evidence by his counsel, among the causes of the verdict that followed. The evidence being concluded and counsel on both sides having addressed the jury, the presiding judge summed up the case, and the jury retired to consider their verdict. Their deliberation was not a long one. After an absence reported to have been of a few hours, the jury returned to the court. Upon the charge of the wilful murder of Bella Wright, the jury found the prisoner not guilty. Ronald Vivian Light was acquitted. The date was the 11th of June 1920. He was discharged and he left the court a free man, cleared in law of the killing of Bella Wright. The acquittal was the final legal event in the case. There is no appeal against an acquittal, and none was possible. In the eye of the law, Ronald Light stood innocent of the death of Bella Wright, and he remained so. No other person was ever charged with the killing. The verdict of the Leicester Assizes closed the criminal proceedings and left the case in the sense that mattered most, exactly where the coroner's inquest had left it a year before, with the death established as a willful murder in the hand that had done it unaccounted for in law. The man who had been tried had been found not guilty, and no one else was ever brought before a court to answer for the death of the young woman on the road. The verdict was received with the closest public interest and was widely reported, and it divided opinion at the time, as it has divided opinion ever since. There were those who held that a guilty man had been allowed to escape, and there were those who held that an innocent man had been rightly cleared of a charge that the evidence could not sustain. Both views were held then, and both have been held in every account of the case that has been written since. The verdict was, and remains, legally final. The question of what truly happened upon the road near Little Stretton on the evening of the 5th of July was not resolved by it, and could not be, for a verdict of not guilty answers only the question that is put to the jury, which is whether the Crown has proved its case, and not the wider question of what took place. After his acquittal, Ronald Light passed out of the public view. He lived out the remainder of his life, a free man in relative obscurity, and the details of his later years form no part of the legal record of the case, and are not established here with any certainty. What the record establishes is that he was tried, that he was acquitted, and that he was never again charged in connection with the death of Bella Wright. Bella Wright herself was buried in her own village, among the country people to whom she had belonged. Her life ended at 21, upon a road she had ridden many times before. The green bicycle, drawn from the canal with its numbers filed away, had brought a man to trial, but had not brought the case to an answer. In the years and decades that followed, the case did not fade from memory, as so many cases do, but held its place among the most discussed of English unsolved crimes. It became known, from its central and singular object, as the Green Bicycle Case, or the Green Bicycle Mystery, and under that name it has been written of again and again. The peculiar features that had marked it from the first, the lonely road, the young woman shot dead in the open on a summer evening, the stranger on the green machine, the long fruitless search, the recovery of the defaced frame from the canal, and the dead crow in the gateway, gave it a hold upon the imagination that more ordinary cases did not possess, and each of these features has been turned over and examined in the accounts that have appeared in the centuries since. Writers who have returned to the case have reached differing conclusions, and no agreement has been arrived at. Some have set out the evidence and argued that the acquittal was correct, that the case against Ronald Light fell short of proof, and that a doubt remained which entitled him to his freedom. Others have re-examined the same materials and reached a contrary view. The re-examinations have been conducted with care and at length, and they have added to the literature of the case without settling it, for the materials that survive, full as they are upon many points, do not contain the one thing that would resolve the matter, which is a witness to the death itself. The case has been kept before the public through book-length studies and through reconstructions, and a centenary of the death was marked in Leicester with an exhibition drawing together the surviving records and objects of the case. The place that the Green Bicycle Case came to hold in the memory of the country was in part a national one, and in part particular to the county in which it had occurred. Nationally, it became a byword for the unsolved mystery, one of that small number of cases whose names are known far beyond the district in which they happened and are reached for whenever a killing without an answer is spoken of. Regionally, in Leicestershire, it became and remained the most famous of the county's crimes, the case that the district could not forget, tied as it was to particular villages and roads that continued to exist and to be known by the names they had borne in 1919. The lanes between Goulby, Little Stretton and Stoughton did not change greatly with the passing of the years, and the association of that quiet country with the death of the young woman on the bicycle persisted long after the persons concerned had died. The case held a further significance in the history of English criminal justice, apart from its fame as a mystery. It was among the earlier cases in which the tracing of a defaced serial number played a decisive part, in which the patience of those who followed a filed and half-obliterated mark upon a piece of manufactured metal produced the connection that ordinary inquiry had failed to make. It stood also as a case that turned upon contested ballistic and medical evidence, upon the question of what could and could not be proved about a bullet and the weapon that had fired it, at a date when the science of such matters was still in its early condition. And it stood not least as a celebrated example of the advocate's art, for the defence conducted by Sir Edward Marshall Hall was long remembered as among the notable performances of a notable career, and the case took its place in the accounts of his life and work as one of the trials by which he was remembered. The records of the case survived well. The full record of the proceedings at the Leicester Assizes remained, together with the extensive reports of the newspapers, which had followed the matter from the finding of the body through the long search and the recovery of the bicycle to the trial and the acquittal. The volume of contemporary material was large, for the case had commanded the attention of the press across the country for the better part of a year, and it is from this body of report and record that the later accounts have been drawn. The survival of so full a record is one of the reasons that the case has continued to be examined, for it offers to each new writer the same materials, complete upon nearly every point, but silent upon the one point that matters most. The setting in which the case unfolded belonged to a particular moment in the life of the country, the first summer of the peace, after the Great War. The men of the villages had gone to the war and had come back, or had not come back, and those who returned came into a civilian world that had been altered by their absence, and that they in turn regarded with altered eyes. The war had left in private hands, throughout the country, a great quantity of the weapons and ammunition of military service, revolvers and cartridges of the service pattern that had gone out with the armies and had not all come back into official keeping. This circulation of service weapons among the ordinary population was a plain fact of the year 1919, and it was a fact central to the case, for the death of Bella Wright was caused by a bullet of exactly that pattern, fired from a weapon of the kind that the war had scattered through the country. The bicycle, too, belonged to its moment. In the England of that year, the bicycle was the ordinary vehicle of the working population, of the young especially, and above all of the country districts, where the distances between home and work and the homes of relations were too great to walk, and where few could keep a horse or command any other conveyance. For a young woman such as Bella Wright, employed in a factory in the town and living in a village some miles away, the bicycle was the plain instrument of her daily life, the means by which she held her employment, visited her family, and moved about the country in the freedom that the machine had brought to people of her condition within the space of a single generation. It was upon that ordinary instrument of an ordinary life that she rode out on the last evening, and it was another such machine, distinguished only by its colour, that carried the stranger who rode beside her. The country through which she rode was farming country, and the season was the height of its year. The 5th of July fell in the long weeks before the harvest, when the days were at their fullest length, and the light lay late upon the fields. The lanes ran between hedgerows and open ground, quiet in the evening, carrying little traffic once the labour of the day was done. A person might ride for a mile or more upon such a road and meet no one, and the very emptiness that made the country pleasant to ride through in the summer light was the emptiness that left the road near Little Stretton without a single witness at the hour that mattered. The conditions that placed a young woman and a stranger alone upon a lonely lane in the last of a July evening were the ordinary conditions of that country at that season, and it was within those ordinary conditions that the death occurred. The town to which her working life was tied lay a few miles off, a manufacturing place of some size and industry, its labour given to the making of goods, in which the rubber trade, among others, had its part. The night shift on which Bella Wright worked was one of the regular features of factory labour in such a town, the works running through the hours of darkness as through the hours of day, and the workers travelling to and from them at the edges of the night. Her hours had accustomed her to movement in the low light and the dark, along the roads between the town and her village, and the routine of that travel was the frame of her days. It is a plain measure of how ordinary her last journey was, that it differed in nothing from the countless journeys she'd made before. A ride out from her home to visit her uncle on a fine Saturday evening, along roads she had known from her childhood. The uncle she rode out to visit, George Measures, lived at Goulby, and it was his cottage that was the destination of her last journey, and the last place at which her family saw her living. The visit itself was of the most commonplace kind, a young woman calling upon her relations on a summer evening, and the household received her as they would have received her at any time. It was only the presence of the stranger, waiting in the road with his green machine while she sat within, that marks the evening as in any way out of the common, and even that would have signified nothing had the evening ended as it should have ended, with the young woman riding home to Stoughton and arriving there. The relations at Goulby could have had no reason, as she left them at 9:15, to suppose that they were looking upon her for the last time, or that the stranger in the road would become the object of a search that would run the length of the country and the length of a year. The farmer who found her, Joseph Cowell, was a man of the district going about his own business upon the road when he came upon the young woman lying in it, and the ordinariness of his part in the matter is itself a feature of the case. He was not looking for anything. He came upon the scene as any traveller upon that road might have come upon it, and his first thought that there had been an accident was the thought that the sight naturally produced. For a person lying in a country lane beside a fallen bicycle in the evening is far more likely, in the common run of things, to have suffered a fall or a faint than to have been shot dead. It was the discovery of the wound that overturned the natural explanation and disclosed the true one, and from that moment the ordinary evening became the case that would not be forgotten. Of the many particulars that attached themselves to the case and were carried down in the accounts of it, the dead bird in the gateway remained among the most persistent, precisely because it explained nothing and could be fitted to no account of the death. A gorged and bloodied carrion crow lying in the field close by the place where the young woman had fallen was a thing that the mind reached to connect with the death and could not connect, and it has been set down in every telling of the case as a circumstance both vivid and unexplained. Whether it bore any relation whatever to the events upon the road, or was no more than a chance of the countryside that happened to lie near the scene, has never been determined, and it stands in the record as it stood in the field, a fact without an explanation, remarked by all and accounted for by none. The spent bullet recovered from the road told, in its own way, more than the bird, for it fixed the manner of the death and pointed to the pattern of the weapon, and it was upon the interpretation of such objects, the bullet, the cartridges drawn from the canal, the holster, that the whole legal contest would afterward turn. Yet even the bullet, solid and material as it was, could not by itself carry the case to a conclusion, for it could establish how Bella Wright had died and could indicate the kind of weapon that had killed her, but it could not name the hand that had held that weapon. The objects in the case, the bicycle, the bullet, the cartridges, the holster, were many, and were closely examined, and each was made to yield what it could, but the sum of what they yielded stopped short in the end of the one thing that would have closed the matter. The record was entered. No further legal proceedings followed. The record closed without resolution. That is where the record of the second case ends. We turn now to the last of these three accounts, quieter still than the two before it, and older by more than 20 years. It belongs to a different England, to the last decade of the old century rather than the years after the Great War, and to the crowded southern suburbs of London rather than a coast road or a country lane. Yet it turns upon the same question the others could not answer, the question of who it was that a woman met upon an ordinary journey home, and why that journey was her last. The case of Elizabeth Annie Camp begins in London in the winter of 1897. The city in that year was the largest in the world, a capital of some 4.5 million people spread across the two banks of the Thames, and 1897 was the year of the Diamond Jubilee, the 60th year of Queen Victoria's reign. It was a London of gaslight and horse traffic, of public houses on every corner, and of the suburban railway that was steadily binding the outlying districts to the centre. To the south and west of the river lay Walworth, Lambeth, Wandsworth and Putney, working districts of terraced streets, small shops and licensed houses served by the lines of the London and South Western Railway that ran into the great terminus at Waterloo. It was along one of those lines, on an evening train running in toward Waterloo, that Elizabeth Camp met her death. Walworth, where she lived and worked, was a densely built quarter of the borough of Suffolk, south of the river and east of Lambeth. Its streets were narrow and continuous, its population large and largely poor, and its economic life turned upon small trade, the markets, and the labour of the nearby wharves and workshops. East Street, where her fiancé kept his business, was one of the district's busy market streets, lined with stalls and shop fronts selling provisions to the working families of the neighbourhood. The public houses of Walworth were numerous and well frequented, and the keeping of such a house was a position of some standing among the working people, requiring trust, capability, and a steady head. It was such a position that Elizabeth Camp held. The railway that carried her was the London and South Western, one of the principal companies serving the counties to the south and west of the capital. Its trains ran in from Hounslow, Richmond, and the outlying suburbs toward Waterloo, and the carriages then in general use upon the suburban services were of the non-corridor type. A non-corridor carriage was divided into separate compartments, each with its own doors opening directly onto the platform, and with no passage connecting one compartment to another, nor any means of passing along the train to the guard while it was in motion. Once a train had left a station, each compartment was sealed until the next stop, and a passenger travelling alone in such a compartment was, for the length of that run, entirely beyond the reach or sight of anyone else aboard. This arrangement, ordinary and unremarkable in 1897, is central to the account that follows. Elizabeth Annie Camp was 33 years of age at the time of her death. She had been born about the year 1863 or 1864, though the precise date of her birth is not established in the record available for this account, and the details of her parentage and early childhood are likewise not well documented. What the record does establish is the life she had made for herself by 1897. She was a working woman of South London, capable and well regarded, and she held the post of housekeeper and barmaid at the Good Intent, a public house at Walworth. The keeping of the house was work of responsibility, the management of a busy licensed trade, the handling of money, the ordering of supplies, and the daily governance of a public room. She was known as industrious and respectable, and nothing in her manner of life had drawn ill will or suggested an enemy. She had sisters living out toward the west of London, in the direction of Hounslow and Hammersmith, and it was her custom to visit them. The names and exact addresses of these sisters are not preserved in the record available for this account, and they are referred to here only in the general terms the sources allow. What is established is that on the day of her death she travelled westward from London to spend the day with them, and that she made the return journey toward Waterloo in the evening. Her family connection lay in that western direction, and the railway was the ordinary means by which she kept it. By the winter of 1897, Elizabeth Camp was engaged to be married. Her intended husband was Edward Berry, a fruiterer, which is to say a greengrocer, who kept a business in East Street, Woolworth. The wedding was near at hand. The arrangements were in their final stages, and the marriage was expected to take place within a matter of weeks. On the evening of her death, the two had intended to meet at Waterloo and to speak together of those final arrangements. This circumstance, that she was a woman upon the point of marriage, returning from an ordinary family visit to meet the man she was to wed, was among the facts that gave the case its particular hold upon public attention in the weeks that followed. Now back to the record. The day in question was Thursday, the 11th of February 1897. Elizabeth Camp had spent that day, as she had often done before, in the company of her sisters in the western suburbs, in the Hounslow direction, beyond the reach of the inner districts. The visit itself was unremarkable, an ordinary day passed among family, and nothing recorded of it suggested that anything was amiss. As the evening drew on, she took her leave and made her way to the railway, to travel back into London upon the London and South Western line toward Waterloo, where Edward Berry was to be waiting for her upon the platform. She boarded the evening train, the service due at Waterloo about 8 o'clock. The exact designation of the train has been given in some accounts as the service timed at 42 minutes past 7, but the hour is best stated as the evening train due at Waterloo at about 8 in the evening. She took her place in a second-class compartment of the non-corridor type, a compartment sealed between stations with no passage to any other part of the train. The train ran in from the west through the southern suburbs by way of the stretch of line that passed through Putney and Wandsworth on its approach to the terminus. Along that run, the compartment in which she sat was closed to the world outside, opened only when the train drew up at a station and its doors were released onto the platform. Edward Berry kept his appointment. He was upon the platform at Waterloo when the train ran in and came to its stand, waiting to meet the woman he was shortly to marry and to speak with her of their wedding. The train arrived. The doors were opened. The passengers stepped down, but Elizabeth Camp did not step down among them. Berry waited, and she did not come. She had boarded the train in the west, in a compartment of her own, and when that same train stood at the end of its journey, she was not to be seen upon the platform where she had been expected. What had passed within the sealed compartment during the run-in toward Waterloo was not witnessed by any living person who has left an account of it. At some point along the journey, in a compartment closed between stations and beyond the reach of any other traveller, Elizabeth Camp was attacked. She was killed by several heavy blows to the head, injuries that were severe and that proved rapidly fatal. Her body was afterwards forced down and thrust beneath the seat of the compartment, pushed under the bench out of ordinary view, so that a passenger glancing in at a station might not readily have seen that anything was wrong. The compartment carried her the remainder of the way into Waterloo in that condition, unseen and unremarked, while her intended husband waited upon the platform ahead. The discovery was made after the train had come to its stand at the terminus and the passengers had left it. In the ordinary course of the railway's working, the carriages standing empty at the end of a journey were gone over by the cleaning staff before being taken out of service or made ready for their next use. A carriage cleaner, working along the line of the stationary train and passing from compartment to compartment, came upon the second-class compartment in which Elizabeth Camp had travelled. There he saw a woman's legs protruding from beneath one of the seats. On looking closer, he found the body of a woman thrust under the bench of the compartment, and it was in this way, by a cleaner going about the routine work of the railway, that the murder was first discovered. The alarm was raised, and railway officials attended the compartment where the body lay. The circumstances were at once plainly those of a violent death. A woman who had boarded a train alive in the western suburbs had been carried into Waterloo dead, killed within a sealed compartment upon a journey of less than an hour, and concealed beneath the seat where she had been travelling. The discovery was made not at the scene of the attack but at the end of the line, some distance and some minutes removed from wherever upon the run the blows had fallen. From the first, then, the case presented a difficulty that would shape everything that followed. The place of the murder was not a fixed room that could be sealed and examined, but a moving compartment that had passed over miles of line between the last station at which the victim might have been seen alive and the terminus at which he was found dead. The response of the authorities to the discovery was gravely hampered at the very outset by a failure of communication between the several bodies concerned. The murder had occurred upon railway premises, aboard a railway train, and the first knowledge of it lay with the railway staff and the railway's own police. The Metropolitan Police, whose officers would carry the burden of any criminal investigation, were not informed of the murder for several hours after the body had been found. In the confusion of that evening, amid the question of whose responsibility the matter was and by what channel word ought to have been passed, the notice that should have gone at once to the Metropolitan Force was delayed. Those hours lost at the very beginning could not afterward be recovered, and their loss would be remembered as among the gravest features of the case. When the Metropolitan Police did take up the investigation, it was formally opened and pursued with the means available to the constabulary of 1897. Officers were dispatched to Waterloo and to the compartment in which the body had been found. The train itself was examined, and the line over which it had run was searched. Statements were taken from the railway staff, from the cleaner who had made the discovery, and from those who had had charge of the train upon its journey in. The movements of the dead woman that day were traced backward, from the platform at Waterloo where she had been expected, to the western suburbs from which she had set out, and to the sisters she had spent the day among. The inquiry sought to establish where upon the run the attack had taken place, and whether any person had been seen to enter or leave her compartment at the stations along the way. The search of the line yielded the single most significant material discovery of the investigation. Upon the embankment of the railway, on the stretch between Putney and Wandsworth, the police recovered a chemist's pestle, the heavy instrument used with a mortar for the grinding of substances. The pestle was stained with blood. It was believed to be the weapon with which the blows had been struck, cast from the moving train onto the embankment as it ran in toward Waterloo. The place of its finding, upon that particular stretch of line, gave some indication of the portion of the journey upon which the attack was likely to have occurred, and narrowed, though it could not fix, the interval within which the murder had been done. The question of motive was raised at once, and it was not to be settled with certainty. When the body was examined and the compartment gone over, it was found that the dead woman's purse, described as a green purse, was missing, and that her railway ticket was gone as well. Neither was ever recovered. This pointed toward robbery, toward the notion that she had been attacked for what she carried. Yet against that reading stood the fact, given in at least one account, that not everything of value had been taken from her, that some money or articles remained upon her person. Her purse and her ticket were gone, though not all that she had was taken, and because of this the question of whether robbery had been the true purpose of the attack, or only a part of it, or merely its appearance, was never finally resolved. The motive was never settled. The investigation extended to the persons who might have travelled upon the train or been seen about the stations along its route. Witnesses were sought at the stations between the western suburbs and Waterloo, and inquiries were made after any passenger who had shared the compartment or been observed entering or leaving it. It was in the course of these wider enquiries that the police came to hear of a particular man, spoken of afterward but never charged, whose circumstances drew the attention of the investigation. This man was described as a person of good family who was said to have a history of violent mental instability. It was reported of him that on the day before the murder he had left his home carrying a pestle, and that he had returned without it. It was further said that he was afterward confined to a private asylum. This description, however, was second-hand. It was an account given after the event, and it was never tested in any court, never put to proof, never examined under oath against a man in the dock. No reliable name for this man stands in the public record for narration, and he cannot be, and must not be, called the murderer of Elizabeth Camp. He was a man described afterward and never charged. What is established is only that the investigation heard of such a person, and that the delay in the first hours of the case had a direct bearing upon what became of the inquiry into him, for it was the notification delay, the several hours lost before the Metropolitan Police were told of the murder, that was afterward held to have allowed a promising line of inquiry to slip away. Sir Edward Bradford, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, later publicly recorded that the delay had permitted a suspect to remove himself before he could be traced and questioned. The Commissioner's account placed the loss of the case, or the loss of its best chance, upon those first hours when word did not pass as it ought to have done, and when a man who might have been found and examined was instead beyond reach by the time the proper officers took up the search. The admission was a plain one, made by the head of the force itself, and it drew criticism upon the handling of the case, despite the recovery of the weapon and the description of the man never charged. The investigation could bring nothing home to any person. The bloodstained pestle found upon the embankment could be shown to be a weapon, and very probably the weapon, but the forensic science of 1897 could not link such an object decisively to any individual hand. There was no means then in general police use by which an instrument might be tied to the person who had wielded it. The pestle established how the blows had been struck, and roughly where along the line, but not by whom. Inquiries continued, witnesses were pursued, and the movements of the train and its passengers were gone over. Yet no evidence emerged sufficient to charge anyone. No arrest was ever made. The investigation of the murder of Elizabeth Camp was therefore an inquiry marked from its first hour by loss. The scene was a moving compartment that could not be preserved. The first hours were let slip before the proper force was informed. The one man whose circumstances invited attention was gone before he could be traced, and was in any case never more than a man described and never charged. The weapon was found but could speak of no owner. Each of these features compounded the others, and together they carried the case toward the outcome it was to have. A post-mortem examination of the body was conducted by medical men, whose names are not established in the record available for this account. The examination determined that death had been caused by injuries to the head, consistent with heavy blows from a blunt instrument such as the recovered pestle. The injuries were severe and had proved rapidly fatal. There was no occasion to look beyond them for the cause of death, which was plain. The medical evidence established that Elizabeth Camp had been killed by violence, that the violence had been directed to the head, and that the pestle found upon the embankment was consistent with the manner of the injuries. The pestle itself was examined, and the blood upon it was noted, but the science of the day permitted nothing further to be drawn from it. It could not be determined by any examination then available whose blood it bore beyond that of the victim, nor could the object be connected to the hand that had held it. The physicians who gave evidence spoke to the cause of death and to the consistency of the injuries with the weapon. Beyond that, the medical inquiry could not carry the case, and it fell to the coroner's court to receive these findings and to record what they established. An inquest into the death of Elizabeth Annie Camp was convened before the coroner in February 1897 in the ordinary course by which a sudden and violent death was made the subject of official inquiry. The purpose of the inquest was to establish who the deceased was, and when, where, and by what means she had come by her death. It was not the purpose of the inquest to try any person, for no person stood accused, but to enter upon the record the manner of the death, and if it could be found, the responsibility for it. The witnesses called before the coroner included those most nearly concerned with the discovery and the circumstances of the death. Edward Berry, the fiancé, was among them, the man who had waited upon the platform at Waterloo for a woman who did not step down from the train. He spoke to her movements, to the appointment that had brought him to the station, and to the arrangements for the marriage that had been so near. The railway staff gave their evidence, and among them the carriage cleaner who had found the body thrust beneath the seat and who could speak to the condition of the compartment as he had come upon it at the end of the line. The medical witnesses gave their findings as to the cause of death. The missing green purse and the missing ticket were laid before the court, and the recovered pestle, found blood-stained upon the embankment between Putney and Wandsworth, was put in evidence as the instrument by which the death was believed to have been caused. The inquest heard, too, of the manner in which the murder had been discovered and of the interval that had passed before the Metropolitan Police were informed. The circumstances of the sealed compartment were laid out. The arrangement by which a passenger travelling alone was, between one station and the next, beyond the sight or reach of any other soul aboard the train. The court was told where the weapon had been found, and what that finding suggested as to the stretch of line upon which the attack had been done. The evidence, taken together, established beyond question that Elizabeth Camp had been murdered, that she had been killed by blows to the head within her compartment upon the journey in toward Waterloo, and that her body had afterward been forced beneath the seat. What the evidence could not establish was the identity of the person who had done it. The coroner directed the jury upon the law and upon the evidence they had heard, and the jury returned the verdict that the facts required. They found that Elizabeth Annie Camp had been wilfully murdered by some person or persons unknown. This was the verdict entered when a killing was found to be murder, but no culprit could be named, and it was the verdict the evidence compelled. No person had been charged, and so there was no committal, no sending of any accused to stand trial. The inquest closed upon a finding of wilful murder against a person unknown, and the question of who that person was passed from the coroner's court back to the investigation, which had not answered it and would not answer it. No one was ever tried for the murder of Elizabeth Camp. There was no trial, and there was no verdict against any accused, because no accused was ever brought before a court. The described man of good family, spoken of afterward, and confined to a private asylum, was never charged with the crime, and his confinement was not a judicial outcome of the case, nor any proof of his responsibility for it. Whatever had been his circumstances, and whatever the investigation had heard of the pestle he was said to have carried from his home and returned without, the matter was never put to proof against him. He remained a man described and never charged, and the case remained, in law, without a perpetrator. The murder caused a great sensation in London and beyond. A respectable working woman, upon the point of her marriage, returning from an ordinary visit to her family, had been killed within a sealed railway compartment upon an evening train, and her body carried unseen into one of the busiest terminals in the world. The circumstances touched a fear that many who travelled the suburban railways had felt without naming, the fear of the lone passenger, shut for the length of a run within a compartment that no one else could enter and from which no one could summon help. The press gave the case heavy attention. It was addressed in the periodicals of the day, and the Spectator, in its issue of the 20th of February 1897, treated of it under the heading of the murder upon the South Western Railway. The public disquiet that followed fastened in particular upon the character of the non-corridor compartment. It was recognised in the discussion that the murder provoked that the arrangement of the older carriages placed a solitary traveller in a position of real danger. A passenger who found herself alone with a stranger when the doors were shut had no passage by which to leave the compartment while the train was in motion, no ready means of calling the guard, and no prospect of aid until the next station was reached. The murder of Elizabeth Camp gave that recognised hazard a particular and terrible instance, and the concern it raised for the safety of passengers upon such trains was among the durable consequences of the case. Alongside the anxiety over the compartment ran the criticism of the police handling, and above all of the delay in the first hours. The Commissioner's own admission, that the several hours lost before the Metropolitan Force was informed had allowed a suspect to slip away, gave that criticism a firm foundation. It was not a matter of speculation that the case had been hampered at its outset, for the head of the force had said as much. The murder thus entered the record not only as an unsolved killing, but as an instance of failure between the several authorities whose duties met upon the railway's own servants, the railway police, and the Metropolitan Police, none of whom had passed the word as swiftly as the case demanded. Of the further lives of those who'd been closest to Elizabeth Camp, the record available for this account preserves little. Edward Berry, the bereaved fiancé, who had waited for her upon the platform and given his evidence at the inquest, passes out of the record thereafter, and it is not for this account to invent what became of him. Her sisters in the western suburbs, whom she had visited upon the last day of her life, likewise pass from the documents that survive. The place of her burial is not established in the record available for this account. What remained was the case itself, the file of an unsolved murder, and the distinction, grim and enduring, that attached to it. For Elizabeth Camp is remembered as the first woman to be murdered upon a British railway train. In the history of crime upon the railways of Britain, hers is the case that stands at the head of that particular and dreadful list. The first instance in which a woman was killed aboard a train in the ordinary course of a journey. It is by this distinction, more than by any other feature, that her name has been preserved, and it is under this description that the case is chiefly cited in the histories of transport crime. The record of it survives through the official case history maintained by the successors of the railway police and through the contemporary press of 1897, and it is from these that the facts of the case are drawn. The case belongs to a particular moment in the history of the railway and of the city it served. By 1897, the suburban lines of the London and South Western and of the other great companies had woven the outlying districts of London into the daily life of the capital. Working people travel by them in their thousands, to and from their places of employment, to visit family in one suburb or another, to pass between the western reaches and the terminus at Waterloo. The railway was the ordinary means of movement for a woman such as Elizabeth Camp, who kept a public house at Walworth and had sisters toward Hounslow, and who thought nothing of taking the evening train home. The safety of that ordinary means, taken for granted by the great mass of those who used it, was the very thing the case called into question. It belongs too to the state of criminal investigation as it stood at the close of the 19th century. The means by which the police of 1897 might pursue such a case were real but limited. They could search a line and recover a weapon, take statements and trace movements, seek witnesses at stations and follow the report of a suspect. What they could not do was tie a blood-stained instrument to the hand that had wielded it, for the methods that might later have served such a purpose were not yet in police use in England. The systematic identification of individuals by the marks of their fingers was not adopted by the police of this country until after the turn of the century, some years after the murder, and it formed no part of the investigation into the death of Elizabeth Camp. The failure of the pestle to yield an offender was not the failure of any single technique, but the general limit of what the science of the day could do with such an object. Within that limit, and within the loss of the first hours, the case ran its course to the end that has already been described. It was pursued as far as the means of the time allowed, and it stopped where those means and those first losses left it, without an arrest, without a charge, and without an answer. The distinction it carries of the first woman murdered upon a British train is a distinction of misfortune only, and it has kept the case in the histories long after the particulars of the victim's life, so sparely recorded even at the time, had faded from general memory. The line upon which she travelled ran in from the western suburbs through a country that was, in 1897, in the last stages of its passage from field and market garden to continuous town. The stretch between Putney and Wandsworth, where the pestle was afterward found, carried the train across a district of embankments and back gardens, of the rear walls of terraces and the yards of small works, the ordinary edgeland of the growing city seen from a railway carriage in the failing light of a February evening. It was upon this stretch, or near it, that the weapon had been cast from the moving train, and it was here that the searchers of the line recovered it from the embankment, lying among the grass and cinders of the railway's own ground. A February evening in southwest London in that year was a thing of early darkness and cold. By the hour at which the evening train ran in toward Waterloo, the light would have been long gone, and the compartments lit by their own dim lamps, the windows showing little but the reflection of the passengers within and the passing lights of the districts beyond. The train ran through a city already turned to its evening, the public houses filling, the shops of the market street still lit, the traffic of horses and foot passengers moving through the gas-lit thoroughfares of the southern suburbs. Into this ordinary evening the train carried its compartments, each sealed and separate, and in one of them a woman who had set out that morning to visit her family and would not complete the short journey home. The Good Intent, the public house at Woolworth, of which Elizabeth Camp was housekeeper and barmaid, stood among the licensed houses that served the working population of that quarter. Such a house was a centre of the neighbourhood's daily life, a place of custom and resort, and the woman who kept its rooms and served at its bar held a position that was known and marked among those who used it. The keeping of a public house required the daily handling of money and drink and men, the settling of the room, the ordering of the trade, and a steadiness of manner that commanded the respect of the custom. That Elizabeth Camp held such a post and held it well is among the few firm things the record preserves of her character, and it stands in the account not as an interpretation of her nature, but as a fact of her employment. Her fiancé's trade lay a short way off, in East Street, one of the market streets of Woolworth, where Edward Berry kept his business as a fruiterer. East Street was a thoroughfare of stalls and small shops, of provisions sold to the households of the district, and the fruiterer's trade was one of early mornings at the markets, and long days behind the stall or counter. The two lives, the barmaids and the fruiterers, belonged to the same working quarter of South London, and the marriage that was to have joined them was a marriage within that quarter, of two people who kept its trades and knew its streets. It was to speak of that marriage, and of the arrangements now within weeks of their completion, that Berry had gone to Waterloo on the evening of the 11th of February. The distance she had travelled that day was not great by the measure of the railway, though it carried her across the whole breadth of the southern and western suburbs, from Woolworth in the east to the neighbourhoods, toward Hounslow and Hammersmith in the west, and back again. It was the ordinary compass of a working woman's world in the London of the 1890s, a world bounded by the lines of the railway and the reach of the suburban train, within which a day might be given to a visit and the evening to the journey home. The very ordinariness of the journey was among the things that gave the case its hold, for there was nothing in it that any of the thousands who made such journeys might not have made themselves, and nothing in it, until the sealed compartment and the blows within it, to mark it apart from any other evening's travel. The condition in which the body was found, thrust beneath the seat of the compartment, spoke to the manner in which the crime had been concealed for the remainder of the run. A compartment of the non-corridor type, its blinds and its lamp and its closed doors, offered to whoever had struck the blows a space in which the work might be hidden from the platform. A body forced down beneath the bench would not meet the eye of a passenger glancing in from the platform at a station, nor of any who did not enter and look closely. It was for this reason that the train had carried her the length of its remaining journey without alarm, and that the discovery fell at last, not to a fellow passenger, but to a cleaner going compartment by compartment along the emptied train at the end of the line. The searching of the line that followed the discovery was a labour of some extent, for the train had run in over miles of track from the west, and the attack might have fallen at any point along a considerable portion of that run. The recovery of the pestle upon the embankment between Putney and Wandsworth gave the searchers their one fixed material point, a place at which the weapon, at least, had come to earth, and from which some inference might be drawn as to where upon the journey the blows had been struck and the instrument thrown clear. It was the single piece of physical evidence, beyond the body itself and the condition of the compartment, that the investigation was able to recover, and it remained the whole of what the line yielded. The question of the missing purse and ticket, weighed against the articles that remained upon the body, was one the investigation could not resolve, and it is one the record leaves open still. That the green purse and the ticket were gone was certain, and that they were never recovered was certain also. Whether their loss meant that robbery had been the purpose of the attack, or whether the attack had another cause and the purse was taken only as an afterthought or a blind, the evidence did not say. The presence of other valuables upon the body told against the simplest reading that she had been killed for what she carried, and yet the absence of the purse and ticket told against dismissing robbery altogether. The motive was never settled, and it stands in the record among the case's unanswered questions rather than among its established facts. The description of the man spoken of afterward, the man of good family, said to have carried a pestle from his home and returned without it, and to have been confined thereafter to a private asylum, entered the case at second hand and left it unproved. It was never subjected to the test of a court, never set against the man in the presence of a jury, never weighed under the rules by which evidence is examined and challenged. It remained a report, grave enough to have engaged the attention of the investigation and to have figured in the Commissioner's later account of the case, but a report only. The man was not named in the public record for narration, was not charged, and cannot be called the murderer. What the case holds of him is the fact of the report and the fact of the delay that was said to have let him slip beyond the reach of the officers before they could trace and question him. That delay, the loss of the first hours, is the feature by which the case is most often recalled in the histories of police work, set beside the distinction of the first woman murdered upon a train. The two together, the failure of communication at the outset and the singular place of the case in the record of railway crime, are what have kept the murder of Elizabeth Camp in the accounts long after so much else about it faded. The official history maintained by the successors of the railway police preserves the core of the case, the victim and the line, the discovery beneath the seat, the pestle upon the embankment, the late notice to the Metropolitan Force, and the Commissioner's admission of it, and the plain fact that no one was ever charged. The contemporary press of February 1897 preserves the public shape of the case as it stood at the time, the sensation it caused, and the fears it raised. And between these sources, the official record and the press of the day, the case survives in its main lines, while much of its human particular is lost. The exact date of the victim's birth is not established. The names and addresses of her sisters are not preserved beyond the general direction of Hounslow. The names of the physicians who examined the body are not established in the record available for this account, nor the place of her burial. What survives is the outline of a working life ended upon an ordinary journey, and the outline of an investigation that recovered a weapon, heard of a suspect, lost its first hours, and closed without an answer. The place at which the journey was to have ended, the terminus at Waterloo, was in 1897 one of the great gateways of the capital, the London end of the southwestern system, through which passengers passed in their multitudes between the city and the counties to the south and west. Into its platforms, the suburban trains ran in through the evening, disgorging their passengers and standing empty to be cleaned and turned. It was upon one such platform that Edward Berry had waited, among the ordinary crowd of those meeting the incoming trains, and it was into the routine working of such a terminus, the emptying and cleaning of a stood train, that the discovery of the body fell. The very scale and ordinariness of the place formed part of the horror of the case, that a woman could be carried dead into so public and so busy a station, among so many people, and lie unremarked beneath a seat until a cleaner came to the compartment in the course of his work. The safety of passengers upon the suburban railways, brought into question by the case, was a matter that had been felt before it, and was felt more keenly after. The non-corridor carriage, dividing the train into sealed and separate compartments, had been built for the ordinary convenience of a travelling public that did not, in the main, come to harm. Its danger lay in the exceptional case, in the rare conjunction of a solitary passenger and an ill-intentioned stranger shut together for the length of a run, and it was precisely such an exceptional case that the murder of Elizabeth Camp presented. The means by which a passenger in distress might summon aid, the communication cord and the alarm, were matters of continuing attention upon the railways of the period, and the case gave a sharp instance of what might befall a traveller who had, in the moment of need, no ready means of calling for help and no passage by which to escape. The concern was the graver because the victim had been, in every respect that the public could see, an ordinary and respectable traveller, a woman with no enemies and no manner of life that invited danger, killed upon a journey that thousands made without a thought. Had she been a person of irregular habits, or the death the outcome of some known quarrel, the case might have troubled the travelling public less. It was the very absence of any such explanation, the killing of an unremarkable woman upon an unremarkable journey, that fixed the fear, for it suggested that what had befallen her might befall any solitary passenger who happened upon the wrong companion in a sealed compartment. This was the anxiety that the press of February 1897 gave voice to, and that the periodicals weighed in the weeks after the murder. The year in which the murder fell was a year of public celebration, the 60th of the Queen's reign, marked through the summer by the observances of the Diamond Jubilee, when the streets of the capital were given over to processions and the display of an empire at its height. The murder of Elizabeth Camp belonged to the February of that year, to the winter before the summer's celebrations, and it stood in a plain and grim contrast to the mood of the months that followed. The confidence of the age, its faith in order and in the steady working of its institutions, was of a piece with the ordinary trust that carried passengers by the thousand onto the suburban trains. The case did not overturn that confidence, but it marked a point at which the order of the railway and the reach of the police were shown to have their limits, in the sealed compartment that no one could enter, and in the first hours that were let slip. The limits of the investigation, once the case had closed without an arrest, were not to be repaired by any later inquiry. The passage of time removed the witnesses, dispersed the persons who might have been questioned, and set the case beyond the reach of the means that might, in a later age, have been brought to bear upon it. The pestle, recovered and examined at the time, could yield no more to the science of 1897 than it had yielded then. The man spoken of afterward, confined to his private asylum, was never brought within reach of a court, and whatever might have been learned from him was not learned. The case as it closed was the case as it would remain, fixed in the shape the investigation had left it, an unsolved murder with a weapon and a rumour and no accused. The successors of the railway police in maintaining the history of the case have kept it among the notable instances of crime upon the railways of Britain, and it is chiefly through that keeping that the particulars of it have been preserved and set down. The distinction of the first woman murdered upon a British train ensured that the case would not be wholly forgotten, even as the greater part of the human detail of the victim's life passed out of memory. It is cited in the histories of transport crime and in the accounts of unsolved killings, and it is drawn upon in the retellings that have gathered the railway murders of the age into their surveys. Yet it has faded from the general memory of the public, as the sensations of one decade give way to those of the next, and it survives now chiefly in the archives and the specialist histories rather than in any living recollection. What those archives preserve is the record of a woman who lived a working life in a working quarter of South London, who kept a public house at Woolworth and was engaged to a fruiterer of East Street, who visited her sisters in the western suburbs upon an ordinary February day and who boarded an evening train to come home to the man she was to marry. They preserved the fact of her death within a sealed compartment upon that train, the blows to the head that killed her, the concealment of her body beneath the seat, and the discovery of it by a cleaner at Waterloo when the train stood empty at the end of its run. They preserved the search of the line and the finding of the blood-stained pestle upon the embankments between Putney and Wandsworth, the loss of the first hours before the Metropolitan Police were told, and the Commissioner's admission that the delay had let a suspect slip away. They preserved the coroner's inquest and its verdict of wilful murder by a person unknown, and the plain fact that no one was ever charged or tried. Beyond these things the record does not go, and this account does not go beyond the record. The wedding that was to have taken place within weeks did not take place. The arrangements that Edward Berry had gone to Waterloo to discuss were never completed, and the marriage that had been so near was ended before it began. The life that Elizabeth Camp had made, the position of trust she had held, the family she had kept up with across the breadth of the suburbs, came to their end upon an evening train in the February of 1897, in a compartment sealed between stations at the hands of a person the law never named. The case stands in the record as it was left, complete in its outline and unanswered in its central question, the first of its kind, and in its central question, among the many that were never resolved. The particulars that remain unestablished are set down as unestablished, and not supplied by conjecture. The exact hour at which the blows fell is not fixed, though the finding of the weapon narrows the stretch of line upon which they are likely to have been struck. The person who struck them is not known. The purpose for which they were struck, whether robbery or some other cause, is not settled. The missing purse and ticket weighing on the one side, and the valuables that remained weighing on the other. The man of good family, spoken of afterward, remains a report and not a finding. Each of these gaps is a gap in the evidence itself, and each was a gap at the time the case closed, not merely a loss of the record since. The case of Elizabeth Annie Camp was the last of these three cases to enter the historical record. The case file was closed without resolution. No suspect was charged. The record remained as it stood.